Hello and welcome to Planet Outlook. In this episode, my guest is Dr. Abi Vanak, who is an eminent ecologist and conservation biologist. Thank you, Abi, for joining us on Planet Outlook.
Thank you for having me, Ananda. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you today.
Dr. Vanak, you have been, and your entire work is basically trying to understand, promote one of the most misunderstood, if I can use the word misunderstood, and neglected ecosystems in our country, the grassland ecosystem. So for the audience, if you can just give us a sense of the amazing diversity of grasslands we have in our country, from the Himalayan foothills to the arid regions of Gujarat, Rajasthan, and in the Deccan Plateau.
Of course. So when we think of the natural ecosystems of India, for some reason or the other, the open natural habitats or the open natural ecosystems have been ignored. And these come in a variety of shapes and forms. You mentioned grasslands, of course. The grasslands are famous. We've, the Himalayan pastures, the Himalayan meadows, they are the stuff of all the 60s and 70s. Bollywood movies used to rush to these places to shoot all these scenes, beautiful scenes of open grasslands and meadows up in the Himalayas. So we have those alpine pastures, of course, which are full of wildlife, as well as support a lot of domestic animals. Our famous Gaddi and other pastoralists go up from the foothills of the Himalayas up to these pasture lands in the summer to take advantage of this grass. When you come down, lower down into the Himalayas, you also have when you come into the Tarai belt, so where the river floodplains are. So this is a unique habitat that's part of the Himalayan foothills, this Tarai Bhabar tract. Tarai tract, in fact, is the alluvial grasslands, and they are dominated by what's called elephant grass. So when you think of some of our most famous wildlife sanctuaries, including Kaziranga, Dudhwa, parts of Manas, they all form part of what's called the Tarai landscape, and these really tall grasses, seasonally flooded. So these grasslands are maintained in that state by a combination of fire and seasonal flooding. When you move further inland, so away from the Himalayas, as you come further down into the peninsula, and if you go west, then you have, of course, the more arid parts of India, the Rajasthan and Gujarat tracts, but as well as large parts of Haryana, Punjab, the parts of Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh. That entire area used to have vast tracts of grasslands, which were converted into agricultural fields. So, in fact, the area that's the breadbasket of India, the breadbasket of India it used to be pasture lands during pre-colonial and colonial times, and it's when the British brought canal irrigation into this landscape that they were all slowly converted into paddies and wheat fields and other kinds of agricultural lands. The largest remaining tracts of open natural ecosystem, of course, is the Great Indian Desert, the Thar Desert, that extends all the way from Rajasthan into parts of into what's called the Run of Kutch, so the entire the Kutch Peninsula and the Saurashtra Peninsula, or the part of Kutch which is connected to Sindh and the Saurashtra Peninsula. All of these are again open natural systems because they're not normally forested. Okay, there might be patches where there's enough rainfall or enough moisture for them to be forested, but even here they're an open forest, so they're more like a savanna woodland rather than a true forest. But most of these drier open natural ecosystems are characterized by sand dunes, sandy vegetation or sand dune dominated vegetation types, not very tall grasslands, seasonally very dry. So if you come there in the summer, it's all bare bones, nothing is there. But the moment a monsoon comes around, really erupts in life. The most sort of go ahead. Sorry, is there a question?
No, carry on. Yeah.
So one of the most neglected grasslands, or one of the most neglected open natural ecosystems in India are the peninsular grasslands. All the way from south from parts of Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh down to Tamil Nadu. We have parts of the semi-arid tract of grasslands, which are a completely natural habitat and are very similar to the savannas, open grassland savannas that you find in the African continent and in parts of Australia and so on. So, biogeographically, they're the same region. They're characterized with the same kind of rainfall, and they support a similar kind of vegetation, as well as the type of fauna that's found there. I mean, an idea that these are not degraded systems, that they were not previously forests that fell down and converted into these degraded, open habitats. The clue, the proof that this was not so is in the kinds of species that are found there. So you have species that are adapted to grassland habitats, things like black buck, great Indian bustard, chinkara, lesser florican, the Jordan's courser, and a host of other, including the now extinct cheetah and the Indian wolf, were found in these habitats. The Indian wolf, of course, survives in many of these habitats across central India. Okay, so these are all the semi-arid tracts. If you go up in altitude into the grasslands of the Western Ghats, they form part of the Shola grasslands system, the famous Shola grassland mosaic. These are montane grasslands, again very similar. So these are, of course, very wet. There's very high rainfall, and they are maintained by a combination of frost and potentially fire. Okay, at that altitude. So grassland diversity is really high in India, and we need to recognize that these grasslands are natural ecosystems, and they're part of our natural heritage, including the species that exist in them. So by ignoring these ecosystems, then as a consequence of that, we've also periled or doomed the species that continue to occur in this system.
So, as you rightly mentioned, these grasslands are home to a unique set of species, kind of endemic to our country. But yet, these are the areas somehow marked as wastelands, falls under the wasteland, the Atlas of India. So how did this happen? We have a great scientific kind of history and culture in the systems. Our conservation history also is like almost now 50 years old. But how did this happen that we went and marked these areas as wastelands?
So this is a bit of a colonial legacy and now a colonial hangover. The concept of wasteland itself was how the British managed land in India. So basically, if they were not accruing or not earning taxes from any plot of land, then it was considered as wasted. Okay, so any land that was held in commons, therefore not in private hand and not being cultivated or not being put to some useful purpose, then it was waste for them. And so they called it wasteland. Now, unfortunately, a combination of this, the terminology of, using the terminology wasteland and putting all sorts of pastures and commons land in this category, and the forestry policy of the British. So they were mainly interested in harvesting timber from India. This was their legacy. This was the Imperial Forest Service's legacy, and this part of their scientific forestry programming or training. So in their imagination, the native vegetation or the native habitat type of India was these forests, and that's the only thing they were interested in. Anything that was not forest then was either degraded or had to be then converted into using plantations, had to be converted into something that was becoming useful. Okay. This, of course, this thinking has carried on unchanged into the modern forestry bureaucracy in India and in the modern forestry thinking in India. That if something is not covered with forest, then it's a forest blank, and it should be targeted for afforestation activities. So a combination of these two. Okay, in the revenue records, if you look at what the land categorization is, there's no such thing as wasteland. Okay? It is either village commons or revenue land or private land or whatever it is. It is the government of India's explicit policy or stated policy every few years to come up with something called the Wasteland Atlas of India. Now, this is not an administrative boundary. It is only a land class and land use categorization. And it is generated by the National Remote Sensing Center in Hyderabad on the behest of the Department of Land Records, Ministry of Rural Development. They can completely do away with this because it serves no other purpose. Because, the purpose it does serve is that areas that are under wasteland can then be targeted for conversion into non-wasteland categories. Okay, so then it can be converted into agriculture, it can be converted into forest plantation, or in the case of grasslands, it can now be converted into solar power plants. Okay, so this is the policy sort of direction that the government takes. From the forestry side, the areas that are in the semi-arid tracts and which were grasslands or which were savannas under the forest department continue to be targeted for meeting their afforestation campaigns and targets and so on. So either under Green India Mission or using the camper funds or now to meet our Paris Agreement targets. These are the areas that are being selected for planting trees. And tree plantation occurs at an amazingly intensive rate every year in these places. The mortality rates for most of these tree plantations are very high. But this is what happens. In addition to that, because these are part of the semi-arid tract, they are naturally drought prone. Rain is obviously, most of these areas have less than 700, 800 mm of rainfall a year. And so the idea is that if you do soil and moisture conservation works, you'll increase the available water in the landscape for either for village use or for streams or for growing trees. So then what do? They do a lot of contour trenching and these bunding and earthen works in these grasslands, further destroying these ecosystems. So this is the problem. I mean, a combination of the two of these things has created this legacy of an entire ecosystem being branded as wasteland.
Also in one of your very recent scientific papers that were published, you mentioned that less than 5% of grasslands in India have some kind of protection. Even the ones that are protected, do you think they are in good hands? Or because I want to come back to one of the things you mentioned in your opening is the controlled burning. Are we doing too much of controlled burning, or it is a practice to be continued, or you're fine with that practice?
So look, the thing is, we have an interesting history with fire. There was a workshop organized by MOEFCC several years ago on fire policies in India. The fact is that under the law, fire is banned in forested landscapes in India. Now, this ignores both ecological history as well as cultural history of the use of fire. Let's not forget that India has had some human influence on the other for tens of thousands of years. So there's not a single ecosystem in India that doesn't have a human footprint. Most of our lowland forests or forested landscapes that are in the Mesic belt, or the areas between 1000 to 1500 rainfall, okay, all our dry deciduous landscapes, dry deciduous forests, for instance, are actually Mesic savannas. If you look at the tree composition in those areas, they're all dominated by species that are resistant to fire. Okay, even if you look at the sal forests of central India, sal itself is a fire-resistant species. Okay, and in fact, these pure stands of sal that you see are a result of fire. Okay, because of repeated fires, you've got these almost pure stands of sal. So controlling fire or stopping fire in these forests is actually going to be deleterious to the way they exist now. And this is unfortunately what is carried on in the conservation practice of this country, that fire has been completely banned. As a result of which, we are seeing a lot of transformations happening to these landscapes. One of the worst ones is the invasion of species such as lantana. So, for example, in the BR Hills in southern India, the Biligiri Rangan Tiger Reserve, when it was declared a tiger reserve, fire was banned. The Soliga community, who up till that time had used a traditional form of burning, cool season burning to maintain, for allowing them to do honey harvesting, as well as had kept lantana under control in those landscapes. And now that place is completely overrun with lantana once the fire was burned. So this is not the same story everywhere, but it's illustrative. Our grasslands, of course, grass itself. If you watch this wonderful short documentary by William Bond called "The Story of Grass," it shows very clearly that grasses, especially the C4 grasses, the ones that are found in Indian savannas, okay, are dependent on herbivory and fire to periodically remove the growth of this moribund biomass, okay, to remove tree saplings where they may occur, and to allow the grasslands to flourish. So it's ironic that we look to Africa as this continent of savannas, and it's got these wonderful. All of us are hooked to these wonderful documentaries that we see from the African subcontinent, okay, and are amazed by the diversity of wildlife that we have there. But when we have the same thing in India, it's seen as a wasteland, it's seen as a degraded land, and fire has to be banned and controlled, and so on and so forth. So fire policy needs to look. We need to have a proper fire policy. Just like tree planting everywhere is not a good idea, stopping fire also everywhere is not a good idea. So this is something that we need to have more scientific input on, more studies, trying to understand the role of fire ecology.
So in the era of the sixth mass extinction, and how much pressure do you think this conversions of grasslands is putting on the endemic flora and fauna of our country, and what's the kind of way ahead?
Look, we are already on the verge of losing an iconic species. We've lost the Indian cheetah. Okay, now there are some plans to bring a species or subspecies of cheetah back to India under the guise of grassland protection. But the fact is that we are failing to conserve and protect another iconic species, the great Indian bustard. Okay, we are down to less than 100 individuals. Who knows? And this species is most likely going to go extinct in the next 15, 20 years. It's already gone. It's extirpated from most of its range. When I was working in Ananda, the Great Indian Bustard Sanctuary in Maharashtra in 2005 to 2006, there were about 25, 26 bustards in that landscape. Now there may be one or two. Okay. Similarly, the bustard has lost ground. It's almost gone from Karnataka. There are reports that there may be a few, 2 or 3 maybe. Maharashtra, they're almost gone. These are all functionally extinct populations. Once your population dips below a certain level, those populations become functionally extinct. Gujarat also is most likely functionally extinct. Rajasthan has the only last remaining population of bustards which may be viable. But the rate at which the habitats are changing, the rate at which new power plants are coming up, and these are solar and wind, so-called green energy power plants that are coming up there. Okay, it's ironic that what we're calling green energy is destroying habitats. Okay, and is going to directly drive the extinction of an iconic species. So, independent India will see the extinction of the first large wildlife in the next few years. There are plans afoot to. I mean, the captive breeding, conservation breeding program is already ongoing. So maybe it may be saved in captivity, but in the wild, it will most likely go extinct. This is this sounds very pessimistic, but I don't see any direction being taken by the government that shows that that we are paying any seriousness to the conservation of grasslands in India.
Oh, you're very correct in saying when the population drops below 100, the species loses the ecological role. Now, as you rightly said, that the government wants to introduce the African cheetah to kind of bring the grasslands in focus. But the ecology of cheetah is very different. It's a very small, a family of cheetah needs huge space. So do we also have that space for a top predator in this country?
Look, the thing is, I think the decision to reintroduce cheetahs in India is a politically loaded one now. I find very little conservation justification in the reintroduction of the cheetah in India. The idea that they will somehow become the flagship for grasslands is misplaced, because if you look at all the sites that have been identified for establishing the population of cheetahs in India, continue to be in these so-called forested landscapes. I mean, yes, they're still part of the savanna landscape. They're all part of the semi-arid savanna belt. So they're all woodland savannas, and they're perfectly suitable habitat for cheetahs. But they're already part of the protected area network. Okay. If you really wanted to talk about grassland conservation, then let's talk outside the protected area box. Okay. Let's look at these vast landscapes that are completely devoid of any protection status. In fact, many of them are village commons that even now continue to hold a large population of wildlife, both black buck, chinkara, nilgai, as well as support millions of India's pastoralists. So the idea that cheetahs can exist in small sanctuaries is fundamentally misplaced. Because if you think of where cheetahs existed before, they always existed outside areas where tigers and lions would exist. Okay, they are like the wolves in some sense. Wolves continue to live in, between the interstices of where humans exist. And wolves are now fulfilling that ecological role of a top predator in the grasslands of India. So I'm pessimistic, and I'm skeptical that the intended role for the cheetah will be fulfilled without re-examining and without rethinking our model of conservation. Okay,
and it must be very painful for you in terms of, you are one of the country's top ecologists on grasslands, yet both the GIV program and the cheetah program is been kind of now whispered by your alma mater, the Wildlife Institute of India.
The Wildlife Institute of India is the default go-to body for anything that the ministry does. And this has increasingly become the case. I think this is not a good model, because one institution, it's like saying, all medical research in this country should only be done by AIIMS. Okay. We are a vast country. We have, in fact, I find it ironic that the institution that produces the most number of graduates or postgraduates in wildlife science then has no place for their own alumni to play an important role in the scientific management of the country's conservation and wildlife conservation. So there's definitely the ministry needs to rethink its engagement with broader. Not all of us can be in government institutions. Okay? NGOs, especially wildlife NGOs in India, environmental and conservation NGOs in India, have had a rich history of working on crucial wildlife conservation issues. In fact, one of the largest ones, or one of the oldest ones, BNHS, one of the largest ones, WWF, continues to do it. And then, of course, there are people like us at A3 who have been flying the banner of interdisciplinary work for the last 25 years. And, we've people are talking about interdisciplinary now, but 25 years ago, when it was not fashionable, is when organizations like A3 started talking about it. So this recognition has to come into government thinking that we cannot do all this siloed work anymore. When it comes to things like whether it's grassland conservation, wetland conservation, forest conservation, anything, it has to be done collaboratively. And this is the spirit which, I hope things change now. They're going forward, but I do hope that WII and the folks at WII leading these programs can maybe step back a little bit and look at some of the other research that's been produced. Recently, we've just published or uploaded a preprint of a open natural ecosystems map of India. This is one of the first maps. Dr. MD Madhusudan and I have prepared this map. And for the first time, it maps all open natural ecosystems in India at fairly high resolution, 30-meter resolution, using open data source. And it's also, we made it completely open. Anybody can go ahead and download it. We even created a web interface or an app where you can go and look to see for each district what are the proportion of ONE or open natural ecosystem in those landscapes and so on. And we hope this resource is used by planners so that they can identify large areas. And there are large areas of grasslands still left in India that can benefit from some form of conservation action. Not the forest conservation action. I'm not for a minute am I saying we should put more wildlife sanctuaries and more national parks in this. That's not the model that works, in my opinion. But we need non-destructive uses of those landscapes.
So interestingly, you mentioned the interdisciplinary approach, and you also mentioned how the green energy drive is basically doing a lot of harm to these grasslands. But now I wanted to bring one kind of area is these grasslands are also home to a lot of our indigenous communities, which are getting affected in terms of land rights and their pastoral rights. So if you can kind of say something on that.
Sure. So, India has an amazing diversity of indigenous communities who practice nomadic pastoralism. And nomadic pastoralism, so let's step back a little bit. Let's talk about what is it that you can produce from the land. In most places, most people in India are agriculturalists. Agriculture is their main form of livelihood. Now, agriculture, of course, depends on water, depends on rainfall. Not everybody has either land, okay, or lives in a place where there's enough rainfall that you can grow multiple crops in a year. So most of the world's semi-arid landscapes, therefore, raise animals, okay? And to account for all these vagaries and the variation in productivity from year to year, because rainfall is patchy, okay, also low. So they keep their animals on the move. They keep moving with them. So they go to areas which are green, okay. So they might, for example, move into coastal areas, the Dhangars of Maharashtra. They are on the coast in the dry season. And then as soon as the monsoon comes in, they move with the monsoon inland. Okay. and they make this annual migration of several hundred kilometers every year. Similarly, there were nomadic. There continue to be nomadic pastoralists in Gujarat and Rajasthan. There are pastoralists who do the altitudinal migration in the Himalayas. So all these groups of people were historically, unfortunately, oppressed, and first by the British. They were seen as robber tribes, and they were given all sorts of epithets that were meant to, and they were also encouraged to sedentarize. Okay, so because it was felt that if you can't keep control on people, you don't know where people are, you can't catch them, you can't keep them under control. The same problem happens today also. The government's benefits, the social benefits, okay, are for people who live in one place, who have a house, who can be identified by an address. How do you have social benefits reach people on the move all the time? Okay. But being on the move is what allows them to work with the environment. Okay. And in today's climate, or in today's era of climate change, okay, where we know that this dynamism or this variation is only going to increase, okay, these kinds of livelihoods are even more important in securing people's future, because they can continue to move with their livestock. And of course, India's meat consumption and meat production is increasing. We've seen now that the intensive farming can lead to outbreaks of zoonotic diseases. Okay. So the push for poultry, for instance, in these massive factory farms, every time there's a bird flu outbreak, there's a complete panic breaks out. And people, you see culling of hundreds of thousands of birds. Okay. But our indigenous livestock, okay, which have been developed specific to those environments, specific to the climate, for example, the bunny buffalo, okay, found in the harsh, there's a buffalo that's found in temperatures that exceed 47, 48 degrees Celsius in the desert of the bunny. Okay, the bunny grasslands, it goes out to graze at night by itself. Okay, it's adapted. It's a breed that's so hardy. Okay, all day long it sits under the shelter of some shade tree, and at night the Madharis let them out. They go out graze because it's cool, and then they come back again by themselves in the morning. And this breed has good milk yield despite feeding on fairly poor, nutritious, or even saline grasses in this landscape, because so these kinds of breeds that were adapted to those local conditions are all going out now because of this push for intensification of livestock production. So these are all intertwined in some way. Okay, grasslands are being lost, and because of that, you have further intensification of livestock. This push for greater, the hybrids, HF cross and whatnot. As a result of which, people are less dependent on the grasslands for fodder. So then they put them to other uses. Okay. Right now, there's a real estate boom in India. If you go to the grasslands outside Pune or outside Banerjee, you'll see that they've all been converted into these villa plots or housing plots. Okay, and have all been fenced off. So slowly, these landscapes are undergoing change because of other socioeconomic and socio-political changes that are happening in the landscape.
Sorry, before I let you go, I just want to ask basically, the conventional, the conservation way of protecting areas, especially related to grasslands, has never worked in India. I've seen in Madhya Pradesh, I've seen in the Deccan area. So, from a policy point of view, what's the roadmap ahead, or what should be the roadmap ahead?
So, I think that from a policy point of view, what we need to do is prevent the destructive use of grasslands. Because, grasslands are amazingly resilient ecosystems. If you just leave them, they will be fine. Okay? You don't need to do anything to protect them. They are already there. They're protected. They've been there, and please allow people to use them. Let them be grazed. I mean, look at all these landscapes. There are, where I work in outside Baramati, for instance, there's no protection here. There's no protected area there. There's chinkara, there's hyenas, there's jackals, jungle cats, Indian foxes, wolves. All of these are occurring in human-dominated landscapes which have grasslands. The problem is that the incentive is to convert grasslands to other uses. We need to get rid of those. Okay, so the policy should be towards not converting, because currently the policy is for converting grasslands into other use. We need to try and change that. Okay? So solar power plants should not come up in grasslands. We should be looking at expanding our rooftop solar policy more. We have enough built up area, enough gray areas, I call them. Okay, we have enough gray areas for us to put solar. Let's not put solar on green and brown areas. Okay. So that's one of the things. We don't need to create more industrial zones in grassland areas. There are again enough land banks available, private areas available for doing so. I know these are all easy targets for policymakers because they look like they're buying. And for heaven's sakes, let's not talk about afforestation. Okay, let's talk about, this is the UN decade of ecosystem restoration. Grasslands are an ecosystem. We need to be talking about grassland restoration also now. Okay, and we need to understand what are the different ecosystem types of India. We are doing a great disservice to them by forcing our definition of what an ecosystem is onto the native ecosystems of India.
A quick last question, Abi. Knowing you and your passion for work, the grasslands, you must have raised a protest somewhere with the Wasteland Atlas. Has there been a response from the government?
Oh no, there's been no response from the government. I think the government doesn't even know that this kind of a protest exists. And I think that's because the voice is not loud enough. This voice needs to become more mainstream, because if you look at the idea of a wasteland is very appealing. Okay, it's an area that's very poorly used, and we are obsessed with efficiency. We are obsessed with productivity, right? So when people see these kinds of areas, they don't see a beautiful savanna. They see a barren wasteland, and they want to put it to better use. And this is what we want to do. How do we increase the ecological awareness and ecological literacy amongst our policymakers? And I think so. It's people like me have to keep shouting as much as we can, but we also need sort of a broader awakening in our society about the kinds of ecosystems there are and the importance of these out there.
So we shall keep on basically flagging this issue on grasslands. Let's see what we can do together. Thank you, Dr. Vanak, for your wisdom. Thank you so much. Absolute pleasure having you on Planet Outlook. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. It was a great, thank you. It was a great interaction.